Hello and welcome to the Apert syndrome webinar. This is the second webinar in the series that we've done as part of the Rare Connect project. RareConnect.org includes an Apert syndrome community, which you can find the link for here in the chat box. We hope if you're not a member, you can join there and see the last Apert syndrome webinar video and read some of the other articles and stories that are on there. My name is Rob Platika, and I'm an online community manager with eurordis, the European Organization for Rare Diseases, the organization that sponsors Rare Connect. And we're really excited to have some speakers with us today who are going to talk about grief versus depression, taboos and forbidden feelings. We've prepared a bit of things to conversations and ideas to present to you today. And so with that, I hope you can ask your questions or make comments in the chat box, and I'll be here to help anybody who might need it. But now over to Tanya Weisberg, who will introduce everyone else. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Tanya Weisberg, and I would like to introduce our guests today. We have Jeannie Ewing, who will sort of be a co-host because of her master's in counseling. And we have Beth Self-Coleman, who is a fellow Apert mom, just like Jeannie, who is here to discuss the topics of grief versus depression, the stigma, the taboo, the forbiddenness of those emotions. We also have 5 participants. Hello to you all. And let's start this without waiting any longer. I would like to ask you, Jeannie, to define the difference between grief and depression.
Well, in my experience, I have gone to doctors and kind of expressed some feelings of sadness or difficulty in focusing on my daily life, and they automatically want to assume that it's depression and they want to put me on antidepressants. Well, I just know, because I know clinically the difference between grief and depression, I know that that's not what it is. And so I guess I was in the beginning stages after our daughter Sarah was born with Apert syndrome. I was looking more for resources, for help in navigating this sense of loss that I felt. But all I was met with from the medical community was, oh, well, you're depressed, you just need to get on medication. And that was a frustration for me. So what I'd like to do today is talk about what I understand to be the differences between grief and depression, as well as some overlaps and commonalities. So depression is now labeled as major depressive disorder in the DSM-5, which is the most current diagnostic and statistical manual for mental disorders from the American Psychological Association. And major depressive disorder really has to have some pervasive symptoms for 2 or more weeks in order for that to be diagnosed. And some of those include suicidal ideations, major weight loss or weight gain, insomnia or hypersomnia, energy loss and fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, irritable mood, inability to concentrate. And so some of those are overlaps in grief, but not all. And so a lot of times we might, when we're grieving, we might feel lost or have a sense of what's going on, how do I make sense of all this, but we certainly don't necessarily feel like ending our lives or can't get out of bed in the morning. And when those do happen, that's actually called complicated grief. So complicated grief kind of mirrors a psychological diagnosis, because you would need to seek professional help for that. What I understand for grief and I know it's different for everybody, but most of us are kind of at least nominally familiar with the 5 stages of grief. But I feel that those are very incomplete expressions of what grief truly is, and that grief is very multifaceted, that there are a lot of layers that are involved to that, a lot of emotions, a lot of experiences and triggers. So I hope that's kind of a foundational understanding for an introduction to that.
I wanted to ask Beth, if that's okay with you, to tell your story, and then Jeannie, perhaps you can walk us through the 5 stages of grief, as along with Beth's story, so we can understand what it means and where the balance and the scales are tipped or not.
Sure.
Beth, can you tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Yeah, I am from Kansas City. I am a mother of 2. I have a 6-month-old son, and then I have a daughter her name is Phoenix, and she was born with Apert syndrome. She was born C-section after like 20 hours of labor. There was a lot of confusion as to what was going on, because she was a very healthy child, or a newborn. She never went to the NICU, but nobody knew what was wrong until about a month later, when she was able to be diagnosed by a geneticist. So we definitely just spent, that first month just kind of trying to enjoy her, but at the same time, really sad and confused as to like what was going on with her, and so.
And did you feel that those emotions of fear, worry were met with sort of reprimand by either the hospital telling you, oh, don't worry, it'll be okay, or did you feel that you were allowed to be completely overwhelmed? I would assume that, Jeannie, that is stage 1 of grief.
Stage 1 is considered denial, where you're just kind of like, oh, everything's going to be okay. But like I want to point out and make sure this is really clear, that's very much been, the 5 stages has very much been kind of the common general rule that medical and psychological experts, they use that as a platform to say, oh, well, you're in this stage or you're in this stage. But the truth is that grief is much more fluid. So some people may never go into the denial phase. We did not. We knew immediately that something was different about Sarah, and that it was rare, because nobody in the hospital, very similarly to Beth, nobody in the hospital knew what her diagnosis was. There was some speculation. And she did not need to go to the NICU or anything after a long labor for me, and a cesarean as well. But we knew with her fused fingers and her pronounced forehead that something wasn't, quote, normal or typical. And so, but we never went into denial. So technically the first stage is denial, but people can enter right into anger, which is the second stage. People can go into bargaining, which is like, oh, please just make our child okay.
Okay, so Beth, I want you to continue, if that's okay with you, the sequence of emotions, because I read your notes, and I know that since we all share the same experience of having a child with that syndrome, we probably have gone through similar stages, although they can be different according to our circumstances. But since we have here, and Jeannie and myself, I wanted to use our stories to sort of come up with a conversation that's rich in examples. I read that you prayed for Phoenix to not have the syndrome, and that you prayed for you to have the syndrome. Did that help carry you through out of the hospital in the first stage when she was born?
Probably not. I think it kind of just made reality hit so much harder that this wasn't going away. It didn't matter how much I prayed, how hard I prayed. Phoenix had this syndrome, and, God wasn't going to take it away. God wasn't going to give it to me, which I asked, and the answer was no. And
after several weeks, it was just okay, like, this is it. Like, she has this syndrome, and we have to deal with it and help her and, move on with our lives and give her the best possible life. And it was a really hard thing to swallow and accept because I wanted her to be healthy, and she wasn't. And I was just devastated.
Mhm. Right. I don't know how it was for you, but for me, what was very difficult in the beginning was to have to jump into action, provide medical care, as well as pick myself up after a C-section as well, and not have the time to cry my eyes out. Do this, say this, act like this. You got to be strong. You got to be this. Where are we in this? Emotionally, I think that especially the hospital environment, as good as the hospital may be, is not allowing for the mother that or the father who just had that child to receive any counseling in the hospital. There's no support. It's just a child.
Right.
What was your experience?
After Sarah was born, I went back to the recovery room. I didn't see her for several hours. And my husband and I did cry together alone because we knew something wasn't right, and yet we wanted to be able to embrace whatever we had to face. You are right, though, as far as the medical staff. Most of them were very clinical and kind of awkward and uncomfortable when they approached us and said, we've been doing a little research. We kind of suspect maybe there's something called Apert syndrome you might want to look into. We actually received a photocopy from an old medical textbook that had every possible thing that could go wrong with a person that has Apert syndrome, which in my, I was postpartum, and just like you're saying, you're thrown into this crisis that you just are expected to manage with very little emotional support. And then we received this photocopy, which only had devastating news. There was nothing hopeful. We did not know where to turn. We were not given any sort of resources of connecting with people like you or finding people that have Apert syndrome that have successful lives, that are very independent, and they're able to have really an enjoyable life. And that's not the life that was posed for my husband and me, for Sarah, I mean, to us for Sarah. And so we were also very perplexed as to how we were supposed to deal with this. We kind of dealt with the social cues and knew that it was inappropriate to wail and moan and groan and complain at the hospital. But at the same time, we also knew that this was a process and this was very real and raw, and we needed to give ourselves permission to feel along this journey. And so in the midst of this crisis, this initial crisis that we were thrown into, we had moments where we would break down. My husband even told me at work, the first day he went back to work after Sarah was born, he was talking to a good friend of his that's the quality manager he works with, and he just started bawling. And that's very unlike him. But thankfully, the quality manager was very gracious and was a very comforting presence to my husband. So you see, it's just, grief is one of those things I think we have to give ourselves permission to feel.
Beth, how was it for you when you got out of the hospital? Did you feel a stigma? Did you feel a responsibility to turn into Wonder Woman?
I feel like I put a lot of those on myself. That Phoenix would be okay, that we would be okay. And I tried to project that a lot, and and everyone who would look at her would be like, oh, she'll be fine. She's beautiful, and and sometimes I did feel like, oh, I can't be sad that something was wrong with her, or and we was something wrong. But, for the most part, people would let us talk if we needed to, but I often did try to put on this persona that everything was fine.
Mm-hmm. Right. Do you think that it was, for me, what was confusing, because people would either tell me, you can have another child, like I should replace my son with another child, or, don't worry, it's going to be okay. But I think the mourning process for me, once I figured it out, was about mourning the loss of a typical child, not mourning the fact that I have a child that has a disability. Because that, however drastic an experience it is something that you can survive. I think expectations make it very hard for mothers to do their job properly and parent a child with a disability when still we are looked at hysterical, depressive, in need of medication, because we're saying we have sadness, we feel pain. That was my experience. Maybe I'm not describing it well enough, but I felt that dealing with my son's disability, I could handle that, although it's not what I wanted for him. But the sadness that came over me was a sadness that I realized had come from years of expectations. Welcome to Holland.
Yeah, Tanya, I think you're right on with a lot of those points. And I know some of the things that I found to be unhelpful from people that were well-intentioned. And I actually talk about this in a book I'm writing called From Grief to Grace. But one thing that I talk about is some things that people say they mean well, but they are just very unhelpful. And one of those things was, oh, well, God gives special children to special parents. Or like you were told, oh, well, you can have more children. Or I was also told, well, look at the bright side. At least she doesn't have cancer or some other worse, quote, worse situation or problem. And I just found myself feeling more and more discouraged when people would say those things, because it made me realize that this is not something I could easily or readily talk about with my typical support system, that I had to find a support system where people understood this, where they had gone through the same thing or something similar, so that they could say to me, yes, that's exactly how we have felt, or this is how we dealt with those situations. So for me, it was kind of rebuilding that support system and kind of paying attention to those little nuances from people where I knew that they were uncomfortable talking about this, they didn't know what to say or how to be helpful, and just being able to kind of minimally share with those people. And then I just did a lot of research to try to find communities like this, like Rare Connect or the Apert Syndrome Awareness Group on Facebook, apert.org. There were a lot of Google searches that I did to try to find a human contact that was either a parent of a child with Apert syndrome or they themselves had Apert syndrome, so I could better understand what this looks like in the world, like how unique it was or how it manifested in people's lives, not just from listening to people that didn't know or couldn't relate.
Correct. Beth, do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I would say my situation was very similar to Jeannie's. People would say, God can't do, what you can't handle. And I always interpreted that, well, if I was weaker, then would he have given me a healthy child? So kind of felt like it was my fault because I was so strong, he gave me an unhealthy child. Or, like, at least it's not fill in the blank, with whatever horrible thing they could think of, another syndrome or cancer, like Jeannie said. And, I would still feel like, well, she still has Apert syndrome and she still has all these surgeries. So it's still really bad. And, I did feel much better about, talking to other Apert mothers about this, and they were the ones who could understand, how I felt about the entire situation and what people would say, and, their well-meaning words were actually probably more hurtful than helpful.
Right. And have you ever felt yourself go through the tides of either grief into depression or depression into grief? How did you survive?
Beth or me?
Either Beth, if her feed comes back.
I'm here. Can you repeat the
I know.
question?
How did you survive yes, the question was, how did you manage the feeling of my child doesn't belong, I have to get support in a closed group to get support, I'm not part of real life. How did you manage navigating those two realities? Because I would think that living in two different worlds is difficult, as I've experienced it as well. Did you feel like you had to go from one to the other?
For me, I would say yes, it did cause some emotional hardship, but I quickly discovered after Sarah was born and I did this wrestling with my own, all this darkness that kind of enshrouded me. I felt like I was just engulfed in this deep, dark place where it was unknown. I felt angry. I was uncertain. I actually also had some friends, some close friends that had babies the same week that Sarah was born, and so I was angry that they were born typical and my child wasn't. There were times I would hold Sarah and I would think, who are you? Or are you going to be okay? It was a very bizarre bond that I had with her, especially comparatively speaking with my older daughter, Felicity, who was born, at least born typical. She does have special needs now. But that was a very dark place for me, probably the darkest in my life. And probably one could have said that I was clinically depressed. However, I really felt like there was a pivotal point for me where I realized I could either choose to be a victim and to remain in this dark place and to just be depressed and to wallow in this situation and have people feel sorry for us, which they did naturally. And I could play that role if I chose and just say, why me? And this is horrible, but this is my life. Oh, woe is me. Or I could choose victory. And when I say victory, I mean I could choose to rise above it. I could choose to find meaning and value and purpose in this circumstance that we were handed. We did not choose it, but it was handed to us. And how could we deal with it so that we could find joy in our life again, so that we could discover what a new normal looked like in our family, even though our family wouldn't look like the typical family, but that's okay. How was God asking us to be a light and a witness to other people who were also suffering, maybe suffering similar situations or maybe different things? And so those were things, that was the pivotal point for me that I had to make that decision. And I did. I consciously made that decision that no, I was not going to be a victim. I was not going to remain in a place of sorrow and anguish and frustration forever, although I recognized that those feelings may come up again. That just because I felt angry or frustrated from time to time didn't necessarily make me a victim.
I think after a point I got to where I couldn't, I'd have all these feelings but didn't know what. Can you hear me? I would have all these feelings and I didn't know what to do with them. So I did go seek help, but I had to go find that help myself through, a professional. And she was the one who was able to tell me, okay, this feeling, is X, Y, Z, and this is what you need to do with it. Or, if I was in a certain situation, she could give me ideas of how to handle other people who didn't understand what it was like to have a non-child. And I really felt like that helped me a lot to be able to just function and be a better mother because of it.
Correct. Absolutely. That's a very important point. And I think that what was interesting about this topic is the dichotomy that if we don't go through this mourning process the right way, we become burdened, things become dark and we're not as efficient. So it sort of goes against what is going on in society where people shun depression. We can't talk about it. We can't say we're sad. We can't cry. We can't say, I don't want to have a disabled child because I don't want this for him. We can't say any of that. But on the other hand, I don't feel that we're provided with this cloak of protection that would allow us to go through these mourning stages or stages of grief. So I think you did an amazing thing that was probably, very helpful to you, Beth, that took a lot of guts to do and say, I need this help. Right, Jeannie?
I'd like to add to what you just said, Tanya. I think that's a good segue into talking about the taboo part of this. You're absolutely right. I have found in the Western world, in our culture, that people tend to focus on the superficial, the exterior, that really the subliminal message that we find in society through the media and I think just conversations with people in general is that we should be seeking happiness. And if we're not happy, then something's really wrong and we should either hide it or pretend it doesn't exist. And that if suffering should come to us, that we should run away from it. We should push it away. And so that was a very different approach that my husband and I found actually through our faith, that suffering was something that we needed to enter into with the God of our understanding, that we needed to enter into that suffering and know he was with us in that pain, that he walked with us in that darkness, that it wasn't a place he wanted us to stay, but that it was the reality of the human condition, that this is something that everyone encounters suffering, everyone encounters death and grief and sorrow, and nobody's exempt from that. And if we try to put on a facade and just continue on the way the world would have us do, that our culture says that we should do, then we're not really living authentic lives. And so that was something that my husband and I really felt was important to model to our children, to both Sarah and Felicity, because we want them to grow up with an understanding of what it means to be authentic. What does it mean to be a real person? And that might involve the reality of saying, I don't feel very good today, or I'm kind of sad. And not just acknowledging that feeling, but acknowledging that it's okay to be angry or to be sad, as long as we don't dwell there.
We have another parent who submitted some notes who was not able to participate. And I'm going to take the notes that she sent to go into another direction just for a minute. We were talking about the taboos of depression in our society, the stigma. That parent's child, a boy, died when he was 3 years old from a seizure at night in his bed. And the grief that they felt was obviously overwhelming. But she indicates to me that the grief they were not allowed to feel in the hospital was now okay to be experienced in death. However, that death did not soothe or take away any of the pain of the loss of the child. And it's a very contradictory statement, because in one way you can say, the child had over a dozen surgeries. He is liberated from the earthly shackles. And at the same time, you're aching because the child is not there. But because the child is deceased, it's okay to cry. But it's not okay to cry when you're given your child and, he's born with such challenges. What do you make of that social contradiction, Beth or Jeannie, either one of you?
I think it comes from society not knowing one, proper grief, even for those who have passed, but especially for the living. I know now that we're kind of on the subject, like I also lost my Phoenix. Um, she had a seizure in the middle of the day, and I was, people would say, she's not suffering anymore, which is true, but it was still, I didn't want to hear that. Like, I still had my daughter, and, I was okay, at that point with her having surgeries, and that was life. And so, I think people don't understand that we can grieve a healthy child, and they don't understand that we grieve our healthy child because we want them, to have a good life. And
that personally, for me, advocacy and reaching out to people on social media was a way to take back what had become an uncontrollable destiny. I was not in charge of what my son would be going through. Doctors would be in charge. That was going to be planned for him, and I felt a need to sort of take the bull by the horns, which is why I got on social media and tried to reach out to other parents, which of course I found Beth, I found a lot of other people. Some people have other methods, they do ballet, they do yoga. I don't have another child. Beth, can you talk about the experience of having another child after Phoenix?
yeah, for me, it was a really, almost an odd experience because Phoenix was my oldest, and then having a healthy child and kind of experiencing like what it's supposed to be like, it was a really almost like weird experience of, wow, my son has 10 fingers, he has 10 toes, and I just felt like this is the way it's supposed to be, but it didn't even feel like that because I've had Phoenix, who, she had all of the problems, and so having a typical child was almost too easy. Like, there wasn't therapy once we didn't have to research surgeries and, what, we had to do to take care of her. And so it was almost boring with a typical child. Mm-hmm. And it's been really different having my son versus Wesley, or versus Phoenix. I just feel like I love having my son, but I just feel like there's also something that we could be doing more. So, and that just comes from taking care of Phoenix and not disappearing.
Right. Right. What do you have to say to that, Jeannie, psychologically speaking? Because I think that's a very interesting point. It's almost, you feel like you're not doing enough for the typical child because you're used to doing so much. And it's almost like you're not allowed to enjoy fully the typical child because then you feel like you're maybe cheating on the atypical child. There's a whole mixture of feelings that I've gone through as well, thinking about having another child. Can you say anything to that from a psychological point of view? If, as a friend of a parent whose child has passed on, I sometimes feel like I don't have as much room to discuss my child's progress, even though my...
Hopefully you can hear me, Tanya. Can you hear me, Tanya? This is Jeannie. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and answer. I know Beth. Okay. I would say that there is a little bit of guilt that I feel when, since Sarah actually, she has been doing phenomenally. She just had an appointment yesterday with her cranio and neurosurgeons, and they were pretty astounded that she has only needed one cranial vault reconstruction so far, and that she hasn't needed another one yet. And so there is a little bit of guilt that I feel in sharing that news, but at the same time, I feel like when I hear other people's good news about progress with their about kids, when especially if Sarah's having a surgery or if I'm having a really difficult day, I really feel like it's food for the soul when I hear other parents say, "Yay, my son just got dismissed from the hospital," or "I'm so glad we graduated from therapy today." There's something about sharing in that solidarity, that the joy and the sorrow with other people, that I feel really invigorates me and it kind of is rejuvenating, because I feel like we're all in this together. There's a sense of community that, despite what the success or accomplishments or progress of another versus the intense crisis of another family, all of us can kind of understand both sides. And so we can share in that person's sorrow and struggles, but then the other family who's celebrating something new, we can also rejoice with them. So I feel, for me personally, I feel like it's a gift to be able to participate in both the joys and the sorrows of other Apert families.
I would have to agree with everything that Jeannie just said. I would feel guilty that Phoenix was doing so well, and that there was other children who had more struggles than she had. But I still, wanted to hear from those other parents and, learn from, their experiences and their heartache and just be there for them. And even after she's passed, like, if I have had the opportunity to talk to another mother, who lost another Apert child, and we agreed that we missed talking about Apert, and so I would still want to hear from other parents, just because Phoenix was such, part of our lives. Obviously, she was our daughter. Um, so, because I want to be able to share my heartache, and I want them to be able to share their heartache with me, even though our heartaches are different now.
Well, I'm writing a book called From Grief to Grace, and it's going to chronicle mostly the journey that we've had with Sarah, but also some other experiences with different life events that have triggered grief for me. Addiction is one in my family, as well as mental illness. That's another one in my family. Infertility is something that my husband and I have experienced. So there was just this concept that came up about a year ago in some of my devotional reading and prayers. I really felt like I was supposed to kind of summarize all of these experiences with grief and share what I've learned and how I've overcome each one of them, to find some good and some meaning and purpose in them, to share that with other people. And so that's really what I'm writing about right now, is not so much the grief itself, but what comes after that's positive. That's really what I'm trying to focus on in the book I'm writing.
Mm-hmm. A lot on my blog right now is just, I feel, so much sorrow and sadness over, losing Phoenix. And then through the writing, I'm able to get it all out so that I can function during, the rest of my day, my week, my month. So a lot of it is just me pouring my heart out and how I'm truly feeling so that it doesn't stay inside and I can't, get my sundressed that day. And I really hope it, it helps show other parents that, and other people that, that this grief is forever now.
I'd like to make a point about that if I could. I think that's a good point.
Yes, I have to say something to that.
Okay, sorry, Tanya. I know there's a delay. Okay,
go ahead, Jeannie.
I know what Beth just mentioned about the grief lasts forever. I think that's really important to point out because a lot of times, again, this goes back to kind of the societal viewpoint or the social stigma of grief, is we think that eventually it'll go away. I mean, I remember talking to my mom who lost her mother when my mom was only 12 years old. Her mom died. And she said, growing up, she was told, oh, well, time heals all wounds, or you'll get over it someday. And the truth is that grief, we have to learn that grief can be a companion. And I know that that sounds a little bizarre at first, but what I mean by that is that grief walks with us, that it's something that's always in our hearts that might be latent sometimes, but then we know it's going to manifest at different points in our life, perhaps unexpected times in our lives, and that we're okay with that we're comfortable with that. It becomes a familiar friend. Mm-hmm. And so rather than something that we try to get over or something that we think will heal eventually, we have to just recognize that grief will always exist within us, and that's okay.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I think that I'm now that you mention it, I'm dealing with that pragmatically day to day. I'm not thinking, I stopped trying to have goals and expectations that would help my son overcome the syndrome and how it affects him. We're doing it day to day. Today, we are going to enjoy our life and we're going to care for each other and we're going to make sure that today is the best day you can possibly have. I think that you cannot conquer grief the same way you cannot conquer Apert syndrome the same way. My father will never be back on this planet. I learned that from from losing him, that the grief and the sadness is never gone. And it's what is incredible in this journey that we all share is how often we have to change or adapt our mindset to a situation. I feel I keep expanding my ability to deal with situation, and I guess adaptability is definitely a key asset, for us. And certainly having our community to reach out to has been a wonderful experience. So Beth, I wanted to ask you, since we have been talking for an hour and I could be talking forever about this, is there anything you wanna say before we say goodbye? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, just that, I love talking about Phoenix, and I even love talking about Apert syndrome, and I just want, even though these things they grieve me that she had Apert syndrome, it deeply grieves me that she's gone, I still love talking about them. And I just, to anybody, please, yes, talk to me about her. It's okay, it's okay to bring her up. It's okay to ask me questions about Apert syndrome, and I will answer them. And if I don't want to, I won't answer them. But please don't let that stop you from asking.
Okay. Well, that's good. And you, Jeannie, to wrap up, anything?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. So some final thoughts. I also don't mind when people talk to me about Apert. And actually, that's kind of why I have my blog. It's a resource that I make available to people that actually don't have children with special needs, but it's a place that I kind of refer them to if they feel uncomfortable approaching me or my daughter. And it's also, I feel, a sense of community and family because I do put a lot of heartfelt posts like Beth was talking about her blog. It's a good cathartic, therapeutic means for me to express my feelings, my grief, how I can navigate through them, but also in a way that is fairly public so that other people might benefit from it too. So my blog is called lovealonecreates.com, and I would welcome anybody to peruse it as they would, feel comfortable or ask me any questions too. Even though my daughter Sarah is still alive, I feel the same way that Beth does in the sense that I really enjoy talking about our experiences and our journey and what Apert syndrome is with other people.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we certainly have food for thought for another conversation. I want to thank you both, and I'm very happy that we were able to do this. And even though we've had some difficulties, I think it was a very constructive conversation. So, good night, everybody, and we'll talk to each other soon. Okay.